purpose of this meeting is and give everyone that information. This policy committee is assembled under board policy to make sure that anytime our board is considering a policy that is non-emergent, something that we can take our time and think through and plan for the district, that we get voices from all sorts of perspectives. So this committee is made up of principals, board members, community members, and teachers, former educators, really anybody who has a stake in how this district runs and the things that we consider important for our students and for our teachers. The policy meeting is not open for public comment. However, any policy that is developed here, this board doesn't vote to pass anything. All of these policies are just recommended in whatever form this committee decides up to the full board. And that board has to go through 2 meetings before a policy is adopted. So that allows more time for public input and more time for editing. The purpose of this committee is really a think tank. It's to take different ideas that may come from parents, might come from board members, may come from our administrators, and to take a look at them in detail and talk about it. Do we like some of these changes? Do we think it's necessary or do we not? So nothing here today presented is set in stone. In fact, as much as I can encourage you not to make it set in stone unless I tell you it's statutorily required, which does happen, I ask that you all be creative, give your input. We can always make changes. This board, you can either, this committee rather, can table any policy if you want to wait to discuss it. You can amend policies if we all agree, and we can change the language and recommend it in that form to the board, or we can just send them as they're written. So we have lots of flexibility here. It's not something that I don't want anyone to feel like this is something you can't give your input on, again, unless I kind of tell you, yeah, we're legally required to have this one, which if it is legally required, the agenda should reflect that. So hopefully you'll have advance notice of that. This agenda does seem long today, but I promise you the vast majority of these changes are small. Some of them are even typographical because we went through our yearly internal audit review from the TSBA. Every year they review our policy manuals to make sure that we are compliant in all areas. Easily, I will tell you, one of the best things for me, selfishly, is one of my favorite things they do. It makes my life very easy. And as you can see, we do a lot of things. There's a lot of things that get missed, and they really are our backup. So you'll notice a lot of these are TSBA recommendations. If there's something you don't like, even if the TSBA recommended it, doesn't mean we have to do it. So if there's something that sticks out to you, committee members, that you're like, I'm not sure, don't worry if it's a TSBA model. We can talk about whether that's something we can change. Okay. With that, I'm going to follow along. I'd like to have, in the copies the board has, anything that's going to be removed is struck out, and anything that is new language will be yellow. It is a lot of ink, so we save it by just having the yellow up here on the board. So if you see yellow, that is new language. And you'll also notice in some of our policies today, there'll be bracketed language, and that's for the committee to decide what's to be inserted into that area. Starting with agenda item 1, policy 1.803, tobacco and vape-free schools. This change just removes language that's related to police action. That's outside the school's control at the recommendation of the TSBA model audit. So at this time, what we normally do for our new members and for our audience is we open it to the committee to discuss. The chairman will ask if there is a motion to make a recommendation to the full board. It's seconded, and then we move along.
Is there any questions? All right, do we have a recommendation on policy 1.803? Do we have a motion?
Motion.
Have a second?
Second.
All right. All in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion passes.
Just as a brief point for our fabulous minute taker, Ms. Parisia Lyons, if you do make a motion or a second tonight, if you could just put a hand up. She's trying to stay distant for her family members, so we appreciate that in advance. Policy 3.400, student transportation management. This change added a provision for the handling of unclaimed contracts and routes. And combined policy 3.400 and 3.405 into one bus-related policy so that it wasn't split into 2 locations. And we also updated some language to match the TSBA policy. Prior to this meeting, I resent out this policy based on some good feedback from some of our bus drivers and contractors. I'll point that change out to you here. Number 8, that first sentence came from the TSBA model language, but it doesn't really fit how we operate here in Rutherford County. Our contractors absolutely have their own rights to their buses and how they sell them. We just wanted to make sure by striking that language, we still know that selling the bus doesn't make the contract go with the bus, that the contract is with the human being and the company that we contracted with. So hopefully that change will help out some, and we appreciate our bus contractors for sending that in. I think that was good input.
Had several phone calls on that.
I also have Jason Everett here if we have questions. I'll tell you that we've been working on trying to figure out how to get dropped routes covered, and that was a major component and why we added some of this language. Additionally, as our drivers and our contractors know, we are entering a contract period coming up soon, and a lot of the contract is dependent on board policy. And it felt that if we wanted to make a change like this, that it's most fair to our contractors that they know in advance of contracting what some of the changes in policy we are contemplating might be, rather than after they contract with us. So that's another reason this policy came up tonight. Would you all like to hear from Jason or ask him some questions about this, or do you all have questions?
I'd like to hear Jason's comments on these changes.
Sure. Mr. Abbott.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir, Mr. Young. We've always awarded our contracts with a priority 1 and a priority 2 list. Priority 1 for our drivers wanting to become contractors, and priority 2 is for our contractors that want to grow from 1 to 2 or 2 to 3 to add contracts. Well, this year, due to our driver shortage, COVID, we got all the way through the second priority list and still had many routes left to award. And policy didn't have anything to award those with. So we offered them to everybody. We offered deadhead mileage, and we still have routes uncovered. This policy change would allow us to give us the opportunity to award those contracts that go unclaimed through our existing drivers and contractors.
Is this something we're looking at possibly put into the contract instead of policy? I just could see where this kind of thing would be more advantageous if we had it in the contract versus a policy.
Sure, I can speak to that. Currently, the way our policy reads, or rather the bus contract reads, which we have not changed in any of our iterations and thoughts of pre-drafting anything for the upcoming contract negotiations, says that it's going to be subject to policy. And so this is where this has existed. This language, as it was, take away these changes, how the board policy has existed, is not in the contract expressly, but there's no reason it can't be. So I think we can absolutely, especially if it gives some peace of mind to our contractors that it's not going to change during that contract period, this is how we're rewarding routes, this can be incorporated into the contract. So I think, to answer your question, it can be in both places or either or.
This policy change is just for those routes that go unclaimed through our first priority list and second priority list like we've already had.
Yes, and one question I got that I thought was a good question was why we changed the one contract to all available contracts. To be fully transparent, that's actually how we've already been doing it. So we've been offering all contracts in a lump rather than one at a time, and so we wanted the policy to reflect the actual practice, which I think is a good practice personally, just for efficiency, and to give our contractors, as they go through the list, options.
Mr. Chairman, I have a question, and I realize we're not addressing this. It is in the policy, and Ms. you and I have had a brief conversation about this. In light of why we're revisiting this policy altogether, because of having routes that we couldn't fill and kind of trying to figure out how we can meet some of these needs, I see these 2 full years, the restriction of the 2 full time for 2 consecutive and complete school years. At some point, and we were just discussing this, so is this not something that we could look at contractually as opposed to writing it into the policy? And my concern is, one of the things that we've seen is the demographic of some of our bus drivers. They are more susceptible to currently COVID. And so that's created some challenges for us. We may need to start looking at how we recruit and bring new contractors in, and this looks like it's an obstacle slightly. So is this something we can address in the contract, which I just asked you earlier? So can we talk about that? And
Yeah.
how should we go about doing it? I want to be fair. I feel like some people are making decisions for our contractors without having a good conversation about why is this necessary and how can we come to a happy agreement?
Absolutely. This is something that's not mandated by law. It's something that we have had in here. The intention of it, the history of it being we wanted not only for contractors who hire drivers to have some level of consistent employee time, and some of them I would say, we've had input both ways, that some of them would like it reduced, some would like it increased, so that they can know that bus drivers not going to leave their services when it is so hard to employ bus drivers. However, and it also serves the purpose of driving a bus owning a bus, to go buy a bus is an incredible commitment. So we want our contracted parties to really know what they're getting into by going into that business and working with us. And it's a tough gig, and it's incredible, and they're not thanked enough for what they do. However, there is no legal requirement that we set this. It can be something that we choose to take case by case on who we award contracts to. I think my only note that I would make would be, one, the board, if they do have any, and this committee has any recommendations that we do want to include in policy to give Jason's team or the board in the future direction on maybe what safety expectations or anything that you'd like to set out as a bar or a doorway that you would maybe want to consider. However, that language is not, like I said, required to be in this policy, so we can really be very flexible with it. I know that I think Jason, Baltimore, we were going to have a meeting with some of the contractors here soon. This might be a good topic to bring up in that meeting, even though I know we're going to talk contract. But maybe we can also talk a little bit about this language and get some feedback from that group about what, if they could change this, what would they maybe want to see? And then what kind of obstacles would they see and bring it back? But that's up to you all. Totally, this committee on what you think. But, yep.
I understand it's a huge investment, and I'm super thankful. I've served on the bus committee for a couple years now. There's no doubt they make a huge investment, and in no way do I want to change it to make it not beneficial to them, but I think that we need to readdress it so that it's mutually beneficial. And right now, as we need to add more drivers, potentially, I think we need to explore all of those options, and this language has the potential of interfering in that.
Absolutely.
That's my concern. So how should then we move forward? Should we remove this from the policy today? Should we, if we make a decision today on this policy, can we revisit it the next policy meeting?
Oh, yes. Absolutely. We can always make a recommendation. Anytime you all see anything that's before the committee and on the agenda, I'm comfortable with us looking at and talking about. If we wanted to make a recommendation tonight about a change, we absolutely can. If we wanted to propose factors, we could, or we could leave it and come back to it at any time. Policy is within our board's discretion. This committee meets really at its will and as its need arises, so we can always reconvene and look back at it, maybe with that contractor feedback, or tonight. If anybody on the committee has thoughts about that, they're welcome to however you all would like to go.
I think it may be potentially premature because the whole point would be to get the contractors to have a conversation there. I don't know, Jason, maybe Mr. Everett can speak to a recommendation, or Mr. Spurlock. I don't want to just glaze over this. I think it's an important point.
Mr. Everett.
Yes, I'll tell you, from when you talk about bringing a contractor on, you want a contract with somebody that you have some experience with, that you have something to go off of, which is why that requirement was in there to start with. Also, we don't want somebody making an investment without doing it. That's a significant investment to say, I want to do this, and then realize a month in, I don't want to do this. So we want that factor as well. From our contractor's point of view, they want the drivers as long as they can keep them before they can move on. To be fair, we lose drivers because of that. A 2-year commitment is a long commitment to be able to then move to the next level. So we're kind of in between. We got to have some experience, and we do lose some candidates because of the 2-year mark.
I guess one other question I have is, if this shows up on policy and it shows up in the contract will always supersede the policy, correct?
I think it would depend on where the policy came from, because depending on why a policy change existed, it would, so I'm going to give the lawyer answer of it depends. If we made a policy change because of a legal requirement, it would trump potentially the contract. But I would not recommend we enter a contract that contradicts with policy. I
Right.
just think yeah.
I guess what I'm concerned about, if we get into negotiations on the contract and our contract says one thing, then our policy says something different, we've got to come back and make adjustments to this policy.
Exactly, yes.
Would this be something we want to go back to our contractors? I mean, I think that may be the best route, to go back to the contractors. There could be some language put in there that could be either or, that would give us what we want.
But I think that's a great point. Maybe some carve-out exceptions. If Ms. Johnson, if you're okay with that, I'd be happy to steal a little time from Jason at the contractors meeting and start that conversation with some of our leadership there.
I think, I'm okay with that. So how would we move forward today? Would we leave the policy as it is?
That is up to the committee. So we can either leave it as it is. We can not touch the policy at all. We could leave it exactly how it already is adopted. We could adopt some or all of the changes that we've recommended today, or we could add to it. So we really have pretty broad authority.
I think the changes are absolutely necessary. But I think this is also very important. So however you advise to move forward, that we can adopt those changes and then continue this conversation, but that we make sure we address this as we go through this contract period. I don't know how to appropriately do that, but that would be my desire.
Would we go back and amend it?
That's what I'm thinking. I think what we could do, especially because it is going to impact our contracts, which we got to get done quickly, we can prioritize this, and even if it means like a quick policy meeting where this is the only policy we look at, we can absolutely do that really quick. So what I'm thinking is, if the committee all agrees, I would say we move forward on recommending this to the board as it is presented today. With Jason and I will work with all of our contractors here, and I'm sure now that they're here listening, they can give us input pretty quick, which is awesome, about what, not only the changes that we're making a recommendation on, because I know that they have input on that, but also on that section. And then as soon as we get input really quick, even at the January or February, we can sit down and quickly move this one through. And if we think it'll impact our contract and we think it's going to be a barrier, we might be able to, I'm going to look at Jeff Reed here, but maybe do it as an emergency policy so we can pass it with a single reading of the board, especially if all of the board members agree to it. It always makes it easier.
Thank you.
Any other questions? All right, do we have a motion on student transportation 3.40?
Move to approve, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. Do we have a second? Thank you, Mr. Walls. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes.
Our next policy for consideration is 4.400, textbooks and instructional materials. This is, the first thing I did is combine our policies. We had two policies, one for textbooks and one for instructional materials. So we put those together at the recommendation of the TSBA and Common Sense and put them together. So that's really all that has happened here, with the addition of new waiver language that was adopted by the state board. So you can see that there under selection, this yellow section, this is new. So there's now a mechanism for our board to request a waiver to the state board if they'd like to use a textbook or an instructional material that's not on the list for state-approved textbooks.
Sarah, if I may I add one thing to that?
Yes, please.
So we wouldn't want to change it in policy, but I'm going back to our ELA textbook waiver last year. In order for us to even apply for that waiver, we would have had to have met certain measurement criteria. So each waiver, even if we apply to it, is going to depend on what subject, whether it's CT, English, math, for us to even be able to apply for a waiver.
Okay, any questions? All right, do we have a motion on policy 4.40?
Motion.
All right, thank you, Mr. Spurlock. Do we have a second? Thank you, Ms. Braden. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes.
Thank you. I know adding a hand raise makes it even scarier to do that. I appreciate y'all. I'm going to actually make a request on policy 5.109 that we table this policy. Changes that I made to it were not very substantive, and I heard back from the TSBA. I always send these drafts to the TSBA just to make sure I haven't done something crazy. And they recommended that we actually pare this one down quite a bit. Some of this is old model policy language, and they want us to be able to have a little more flexibility in our evaluations that is more reflective of recent law. So they recommended that we come back again with this one in a shorter version. So I'd ask that if you all are okay with it, I'd like to table it. If anyone else has any input, since I'm taking it back anyway, feel free to let me know too, though. So I can bring it back. All right. Policy 5202, separation practices for non-certified employees. This removes language that implies a due process right for our non-certified at-will employees. So we do still follow a process of when they call up to Dr. Anthony and I and a classified employee needs to be disciplined, we still expect our principals to treat them with respect, to give them reasons and to talk through it. But what we don't want to do is create an absolute bar that we must overcome when it's not legally required. So that's why that is recommended for removal.
Okay, any questions? We have a motion on policy 5.202.
Move to approve.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. We have a second? Second, Ms. Maxwell. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes.
This one's easy. Policy 5.302, sick leave. We remove language related to FMLA because we have an FMLA policy, so we didn't need it to be here too.
Any questions?
That's exactly right. Yes, ma'am.
All right, do we have a motion on policy 5.302?
So moved.
Thank you, Ms. Sharp. Do we have a second? Ms. Moore? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes.
Policy 5.304, long-term leaves of absences for professional personnel. This is the same. It has language related to FMLA. Let me go to that one. And we have an FMLA policy, so it does not need to be here. And the reason we do that, just for the committee members to know, is if there ever is a law change, we don't want to miss that FMLA law exists in many places, and we only change the FMLA policy, therefore ending up with inconsistent policies.
Any questions or discussion? All right, do I have a motion on policy 5.304? Ms. Bratton, do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Estes. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes.
Policy 6.200, this is our attendance policy. This is a very small change, but we removed school-sponsored activities from the excused absence list. Per state board policy, a school-sponsored activity is now deems the student present, so we removed that language.
Any questions or discussion? All right, need a motion for policy 6.200.
Move to approve.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. Do I have a second? Maxwell? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes.
There we go. Okay. This is a pretty extensive change, policy 6.303. It's extensive in its wording change, but from a practice standpoint isn't substantial. This is a change for our policy to closely match the TSBA's policy that is related to law enforcement search and seizures. This is an area of law that's often litigated in the Supreme Court, so it moves pretty frequently. So our policy had become out of date over time in light of that. I also went with the TSBA's recommendation in other areas and removed things that were directive to the police because we really don't have that authority to tell them what to do. We can only control what we can do, right? So things that were truly dictating how a police officer conducts a search, I removed that language as well. I think, just for you all to know, I think in our principals on the committee and that might be present will notice this as a difference. Right now, our policy, I think this will be the biggest change if we do adopt this. Right now, we've had it in policy that a principal is to leave an interrogation of a student if instructed by law enforcement. There's been some opinions in case law that's come out that says because we're serving in loco parentis, we shouldn't leave until a parent takes over and leave that student unsupervised. So our principals will now sit in interrogations. It's very uncommon our officers ask our principals to leave, so I think our SROs will be okay with this. But I'll make sure I communicate this to the captain and make sure he understands it is on board too. And if for some reason, I'll do that before our board meeting, if you do choose to recommend this policy, so I can make sure I have his input on whether that will be a problem for him or not. I don't really know what to do if it will be, because I think it is legal that this is what we need to do, but I do want to make sure we have their buy-in on the front end so that we can be partnered on it.
Ms. Page, if you, I've got one question.
Yes, ma'am.
On page 4 or 5, line 23, where it says insert name of an
Oh, yes.
employee.
Thank you very much. I think this should be principal. We don't have a lot of metal detectors. Mr. Pedigo pointed that out ahead of time, but I wasn't sure. So actually, I wanted the committee to, is there somebody that you all believe should be responsible if we did have metal detectors? My gut was principal, since it'll be within their building. Does anyone have any input for that?
My question is, aren't the SROs trained on that? Are the principals trained also?
Well, actually, yes, because our SROs
If you
can't,
had any.
they have a constitutional bar. They can't just search students at random in that way. So it has to be our personnel that would conduct that search unless we had an articulable reason to search a particular student. Then an SRO might be able to do it. So when you do recommend this one, I would make it with the recommendation that the brackets say administration.
Any other questions, discussion? Okay, do we have a motion for policy 6.303?
Motion.
Thank you, Mr. Spurlock. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Ms. Maxwell. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes.
Our next policy is 6.402, and this is physical examinations and immunizations. This clarified language to match the TSBA model policy that it recommended in its annual audit. I was actually surprised they made the audit finding they did, because our policy was verbally exactly the same. We just didn't have it 1 and 2. It was just a paragraph. So let me go down to that. You'll see here at the end, that was all pretty much exactly the same. It was this language, I just broke it. The reason I didn't highlight it is because it's actually exactly the same. So that 1 and 2 is already in our policy, just not broken out into a numbered list. And that was the main thing they noted. And just as if you're following the news, I know that number 1 might be impacted by a bill that's currently pending with our legislator. So we'll keep an eye on that. And if that law does pass, we'll bring this policy back for amendment so that that language is consistent with that new law.
Any other questions, discussion? Okay, do we have a motion for policy 6.402?
So moved.
Thank you, Mr. Estes. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Spurlock. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes.
Policy 6.411, student wellness. This updates the school health index language to match state board policy. Our old policy said 3, and there's no longer that number indication in board policy. So let me show you that. Where is it? There.
Any questions, discussion? I need a motion on policy 6.411. Move to approve. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes.
Looks like I did not include 6500 in my policy handouts. I apologize that I missed that policy. To give it, I will bring that back to the next meeting. It's not an emergent policy. Our special education student policy is only 2 paragraphs. It just basically says we shall follow IDEA. The TSBA model policy includes an additional 3rd paragraph that directs the director to make procedures relevant to certain major provisions of IDEA. We do have those procedures, but it's nice to have that power from the board reflected. So I will bring that. It's not an emergency. No, we're not out of compliance. I'll bring that back next time so you all see it ahead of time. All right, so that brings us to policy 6.503, homeless students. This is a full rewrite to match the TSBA model policy and remove references to foster students. Our last policy is very detailed, and most of those things were included in our procedures, because there are things that we negotiate with DCS, with other state agencies, maybe about how we transport students, how we conduct BID meetings, things that are very fluid, and so those really make more sense in procedure versus policy that I'll have to bring back over and over.
Any questions, discussion? All right, do we have a motion on 6.503? Thank you, Ms. Braden. Do we have a second? Thank you, Ms. Moore. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes.
All right, now we're on to our brand-new policies. These should hopefully be pretty quick. Policy 4.209, alternative credit options. This is actually a mandated policy by state board rule. This policy lays out specifically what we needed. The most important part is the course access program. That's what we were expressly required to have. And this lays out the appeal process for a parent who may want to use course access programs and then they are denied. It gives them a means to appeal it. So that's the part the state board wanted us to have, and that's why we have this policy. This is new to us. We likely should have had it. It's something that's been around, but we just haven't had this exact policy adopted, and our TSBA model audit caught that for us.
Any other questions? Discussion? All right, do we have a motion for policy 4.209? Thank you, Ms. Moore. Do we have a second? Bratton? All in favor say aye. Any opposed? Motion passes.
All right, policy 4.6051, substitutions for PE credit. This clarifies that this board has the authority to determine that certain outside of school activities can be included for a half credit of PE. Adopting this policy was inspired by one of our fantastic students who does intensive gymnastics, incredible Olympic level gymnastics, which will be, if we adopt this policy, you all will likely see her request for that half credit on the agenda. And so we wanted, even though this is something that's already set out in state board policy, we wanted to make sure we had a policy that laid out the mechanism for our students who maybe do JO or OTC or some sort of intensive outside athletics, that they can get that half credit.
I think the purpose of this additional half credit was for kids to exercise.
Yes.
I think that's a great opportunity.
Absolutely. I know we have lots of students who are incredible athletes that will benefit from this because I think probably the last thing they need in their life is more athletic time. I know the time commitment that they have is incredible for some of those sports.
All right, any good questions, discussion? All right, do we have a motion for policy 4.6051?
Move to approve.
Ms. Sharp, do we have a second?
Second.
Ms. Johnson? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes.
This is policy 5.3031. This is leave for religious observance. This encompasses already the federal standard of what we need to do constitutionally. What I really wanted this for was to clarify that when we do make exceptions to our schedule for employees to accommodate those religious needs, that's going to be, it's unpaid time or does not create a new type of leave that we pay for. And so I wanted to make sure that that was expressed. We don't get a lot of these requests, but we have gotten more over the years, so I wanted principals to understand that that's not a special paid leave that the board has funded outside of our holiday schedule.
Any questions? Okay, do we have a motion for policy 5.3031? Thank you, Ms. Moore. Do I have a second? Ms. Maxwell? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes.
Just as a quick to expedite things a little bit, I think we can take up the next two together if the committee approves, since both of those policies were approved for recommendation. Policy 3.405, contracted bus service, and policy 4.401, textbooks. Both of these policies have been merged into previously recommended policies, so I would ask this committee to approve a motion for them to be recommended for deletion.
All right, do I have a second? Mr. Estes? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes.
And then just a reminder to our board members, if you wouldn't mind staying very briefly after, we have a very brief executive session about some litigation, and then everyone else we're going to kick out, but I'll turn it back over to you.
All right, thank everyone for being here. I appreciate you taking time to come out to this important policy committee. We are adjourned.